Hi, everybody. Welcome to week two of Black Movies, American Lives. It was really good to start with some of you last night reflecting on Malcolm X and Harriet. The one thought that I have waking up this morning is Malcolm X, particularly, is a film that's realistic about what it is to build a social movement. And lots of movement films don't capture this. They're sincere and to coin a phrase, do the right thing, but they don't convey what it's like to confront within yourself what's going on, and you're like the conversion to the need to serve the common good, and then what it's like to build the movement with the false starts, back and forward, infighting, discerning what should we focus on, the evolution of the movement, the aftermath of mistakes, the aftermath of attacks. And I think Malcolm X does this extraordinarily well. I think Ava DuVernay's film Selma does the same thing very well, both the inner journey of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King to a lesser degree, but better than many movies. And then the idea of building a movement around these ideas in people. There's a wonderful British movie called Pride about the relationship between the LGBTQ advocacy community and the striking coal miners in 1984. And Warren Beatty's film about early socialism in the United States called Reds does this very well too. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to watch Malcolm X and to witness this story. And I'm glad you were with us too. And if you weren't with us on the call, or if you're watching these recordings later, you're welcome as well. And we look forward to being in conversation, seeing what we can learn together. Melvin, what you got?
In reflection of last night, the one thing I regret us not being able to dig into a little bit is this notion, this historical notion, or I shouldn't say historical notion, this mythic notion within the American consciousness of Malcolm X being a man of violence. And so I hope that over these 4 weeks, we can kind of interrogate this notion of the reaction to violence being the violence that we pay attention to, right? Like as opposed to the opportunity to see and recognize the violence that is happening and how people are trying in different ways to find a solution, a response that actually brings violence to an end. Because a lot of these movies kind of wrestle with that. So yeah, that's last night was wonderful. As we look towards the next week, what I would like to offer is for us to be able to set the movies kind of in chronological context, right? So we know that Harriet is by and large taking place around the mid 19th century, so around the 1850s, 1860s. It ends, the movie closes out there. And about 100 years later, the story of Malcolm, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, his story is playing out in real time, right? Like, the movie doesn't get made until the 90s, but his story is playing out in the 1950s and 60s. And both are wrestling with this notion of liberation in the United States. What does it take for Black people to be able to live free? Because as our theme, American Dream, talks about, there's this myth about America that America is the land of opportunity. And Malcolm and Harriet are not experiencing that. That's not the story of most Black people in the United States, this notion of the American dream. However, somewhere between the two of them, around the 1920s, a poet crops up. His name is Langston Hughes. And he asks the question, what happens to a dream deferred? and he offers some options that he wants his listeners to consider. He says, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And all of a sudden our minds go back to the play, the Broadway play that was made based on that line, raisin in the sun. Or does it fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? That was Langston's question. And the two movies that we are going to watch together this week explore what happens to a dream deferred. First, we have Boys in the Hood, which takes place about 30 years after the story of Malcolm. And then we have the story of Queen and Slim, which is set about 30 years after Boys in the Hood. And just like in the story, The Life of Malcolm, we see someone wrestling with basically the same challenges to find liberation as what was happening 100 years ago. So too in Queen and Slim, we see young Black people wrestling with the same challenges of a system that will not let them go, that will not let them dream, that will not give them entree into the opportunities that America is supposed to be about. And we see how they deal with that.
So I'm so looking forward to watching them. Haven't seen Boys in the Hood in a long time, and Queen and Slim, which has a reputation for being the Black Bonnie and Clyde, which is a superficial analysis, but maybe a doorway in to think about and to compare and contrast different people's experiences of that system. Here are, in reminder, Melvin's 5 principles of how to watch a movie in the Black Movies American Lives.
Let's call them questions.
the pillars of wisdom. The invitation is, when you're watching the movie, just watch it, just experience it,
just watch it.
But when it's time to reflect, consider the movie for what it says and also what it doesn't say. Mm-hmm. Another way of putting that would be whose voices are heard and whose voices are absent. Mm-hmm. The second thing, to the degree that the story follows an archetype, how have you traditionally heard this type of story told? In Boys in the Hood, the archetype would be the story of gangs, the story of young men gathered in groups, the story of an underclass, the story of, it's in the title of the movie, the Hood itself. How have you traditionally heard this?
At the time that's depicted, the language was inner city. This is the inner city.
That's right. And in the Queen and Slim story, it's the archetype might be called rogues on the run. And I don't mean rogue in a pejorative sense. I mean people who are somewhat outside the mainstream conventions of the way the society's rules, whether those are just or unjust, the way the society's rules dictate how we're supposed to live and how they're supposed to live. What's the archetype of those people outside the system? Because I think you'll notice that in some of those archetypal stories, there are people who live outside the system and they get away with it and they survive and they even thrive. I think about the Ocean's 11 movies, entertaining movies about thieves who get away with it and get to live happy high on the hog. This is a very different version of that story. People in a desperate set of circumstances, not of their own making, And what does the archetype say about these folks? The third thing, list 3 things that you love about the story as you're reflecting on it. The fourth, list 3 things that bug you about the story. And then finally, see if you can discern or surface 3 questions that come to mind when you consider the story. And they can be about the story itself or an issue raised by the story. And bring those with you to our gathering if you're coming to the live call. Peace, everybody. See ya.